Welcome. My name is Mia Ferroletto, and with the help of Susie Cody and everyone up here on stage, we find ourselves here this morning to participate in the first phase of Hemp New York City. Although I lived in Manhattan for 18 years and am still a New Yorker at heart, Vermont is now my home. I was born in Burlington and am proud to share the state with people like Bill McKibben, who led 350.org in stopping the construction of the XL pipeline, and U.S. Senator and presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, who is making a stand for people like you and me. This hall is a hallowed place. When I envisioned organizing an industrial hemp event in Manhattan, I saw it happening here in the Great Hall at Cooper Union. This is where Abraham Lincoln gave his impassioned speech against the advancement of slavery to the Western territories. Currently, we face another form of slavery or control, that of corporatism, that sends our jobs offshore and cripples middle-class Americans. Industrial hemp is one solution to our problems, a major one. As you will hear from these experts, 50,000 products are currently made from industrial hemp, from the doors to BMW cars to Dr. Bronner's magic soap, and there are samples there for you to take home with you when you leave. These products represent farming opportunities for our rural areas, as well as manufacturing for designers and entrepreneurs. The possibilities are limitless, and the benefits to our health are profound, as you will learn today. Thank you, all of you, for your interest in the hemp movement. I'd personally like to thank Eric, Joel, Jamie, Tim, Mike, and Rick for their generosity and forging the road ahead for all of us in this huge movement. Again, my sincere thanks to Susie Cody for her help, assistance, and expertise. I'd also like to thank the artist Glenn Goldberg, who teaches here at Cooper and who created a stunning series of work for the Art on Paper Fair opening March 3rd, all made from hemp. Please visit the fair and check out Glenn's work at booth 621. There's a card in the back. The card and the program for today are all printed on hemp paper and printed by the Colorado Hemp Company. A personal thank you to Brendan Gilmartin, who has saved the day more than once, to Cooper Union, and a special shout out to High New York, because I promised. Now I'd like to introduce you to HIA President Eric Steenstra. Eric?
All right. Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out on this Saturday morning here. This is really an incredible hall, and it's an honor to be able to be here today. I wanted to really thank Mia and Susie for all their hard work in putting this event together. When Mia first called me about the event, I didn't know much about Cooper Union or specifically this hall, and when I started to look into it a little bit, I was really blown away with the history, knowing that, you know, people like Abraham Lincoln stood here in this exact spot and spoke from this podium. This hall has a very rich history, and so, like I said, it's an honor to be here today. I first learned about hemp after reading The Emperor Wears No Clothes. I met someone in 1989 who was in the cannabis movement, marijuana reform, and shared the book with me, and it was a real eye-opener. And at first, I almost couldn't believe what I was reading. I'm thinking, is this really true? And as I dug into it a little bit more, you know, almost everything Jack said, Jack Harrow was the author, and he had written this incredible book that really uncovered a lost and sort of forgotten history of hemp in America. Because, you know, when you go to school, you don't look in the history books and read much about hemp. It's just not in there, and so I didn't know anything about it. So I had, you know, after that experience, I started digging into it a little bit more, and eventually I decided to start a clothing company with a friend of mine. And I don't know what we were thinking. I didn't have any background in the garment trade, but I was just really inspired about hemp, and there were these beautiful hemp fabrics that were coming into country that were available. And so anyways, we ultimately started that company, and it was called Ecolution, and my partner was Steve D'Angelo. And so also had the opportunity to get involved early with the HIA. The Hemp Industries Association was started in 1994, and attended the early meetings with that and got involved with other people in the industry. So I really had a great sort of front row seat to what was happening in the modern era. I mentioned Jack Herer, and I don't know how many of the people in the room have actually read The Emperor Wears No Clothes. And that's great that there's some of you out there, and you know, early on, a lot of the people in the industry had read that book, and I would recommend if you're interested in hemp and you really want to find out sort of about the whole history, that you check out his book. You can actually read it online, the copies there, but if you can get a printed copy, it's better because it has a lot of the materials. Jack actually went out and dug up all these historical documents and cool things. So anyways, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, I definitely recommend that. And Jack was just an incredible, he dedicated his whole life to educating people about cannabis and hemp. And he published the book in multiple different languages. They sold over 1 million copies worldwide, and really started a revolution. Here's a couple of great quotes that I liked from Jack. Jack was a true evangelist, and he believed that hemp was the one plant that sort of saved the planet. And I love this quote, from him about how he believed that hemp was a crop that really could be a savior to the planet. And so in any case, let's see here. Okay, just tell you briefly a little bit about the company that we started. I mentioned this company, Ecolution. It's a clothing company. I'm wearing one of the original shirts that we had. And we also did jeans, and we had cordage, we had paper products. We tried to do a little bit of everything, maybe a little too much, but at that time there was so much demand. A lot of people were really becoming interested in hemp. There were hemp stores popping up everywhere, which is an interesting concept. You don't see a lot of those anymore. They weren't particularly successful in that hemp is better selling on the shelf of a regular store as opposed to having a single store just for hemp. But in any case, those are some of our products, and we had one of the first hemp websites out on the internet in 1994. So the other thing I really want to talk about is just sort of what drove me and a lot of the people that I knew early in the industry was always the idea that, it was crazy that we had to import hemp from China or Canada or Europe or wherever the heck it was. Didn't make any sense. Why weren't we growing it here? We knew we had this long, rich history with hemp, so that's been the driving force for a lot of people in the industry to be able to see hemp being grown by family farmers here in the United States again. So most of you probably know a good bit about hemp. I just was going to give a quick 30-second overview for anybody who didn't. It's distinct varieties of the cannabis plant, typically bred for the fiber and the seed. It's been cultivated for over 10,000 years, going back and originating in China. And you can get food, fuel, fiber, medicine, just about anything you really need from the plant. And it differentiates from marijuana or drug type varieties typically by the THC levels, which most hemp is under 1%, and typical drug types start at 5% and kind of go on up there from there. So. A lot of you may have heard about hemp in colonial America. The founding fathers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, both grew hemp on their plantations. Benjamin Franklin used hemp rag, or the material they used to make paper was old clothing, and so the paper was made from hemp. In fact, even let's see here, you can see some of the traditional methods that are being used here. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Mount Vernon or Colonial Williamsburg, but if you do go there, they do have displays, and they talk about how hemp was used historically in those times for everything from fishing nets to ropes to clothing material. And there's an example of a couple pictures of some women using traditional methods to process the hemp fiber. The Constitution was even drafted on hemp paper. I think the final version ended up being on parchment, but the draft was done on hemp paper. And another big thing at that time was navies. You know, we didn't have cars and planes, and people, people got around the world mostly on ships, and the power of nations was based on their navies. And so hemp was a really important resource at that time, because if you look at a ship, it was primarily made out of wood and then rigged with hemp sails and hemp rope, and even the material that they stuck in between the boards to keep the ship watertight was called oakum, as a hemp fiber material mixed with pine tar. So something like the USS Constitution used 60 tons or 120,000 pounds of hemp fiber on all these different parts of the ship. Here's a little bit more showing on the traditional processing methods throughout the 1800s. That was the typical way that hemp was processed. Mike Lewis, who's going to speak in a little while, bought a small version of a hand brake that's up there at the table if anybody wants to check it out. But this shows a full-size brake being used on hemp stalk. It would put the stalk in and then drop the brake down. It was it was definitely labor-intensive work, but that's how they managed to separate it. Oh, forgot to advance there. Sorry. Whoops. Gotten behind. Thank you, Jamie. All right. So I'm going to skip ahead to the early 20th century, and I mentioned that Jack Herr had uncovered all this history with hemp. Well, the USDA, this was a normal crop that the USDA researched like any other, and they had a guy who was involved in as their botanist in charge of fiber investigations named Leicester Dewey. And he worked for the USDA from about the beginning of the last century up until 1940. Researched all fiber plants, but did a lot of work with hemp. He collected hemp varieties around the world, and then he did breeding for farmers here, and came up with a lot of the varieties that are now, that were popular through that time, and that are still growing wild feral hemp out in places like Kentucky or Indiana. He was a local, lived in Washington, D.C., and all the research was done at a place called Arlington Farms, and there's a really interesting story about that. We actually, somebody just uncovered all of Leicester Dewey's diaries here in New York, in upstate New York. Apparently his last few years were spent there, and somebody found the diaries. He had actually kept daily diaries for almost his entire adult life. And we were able to acquire those just to preserve them. And so as reading through those, we learned a lot about it. One of the things we discovered was that where he was doing a lot of this research was at Arlington Farms, which is now the site of the Pentagon. And so I don't know if any of you have ever been down there when you've been to DC, but across the street from the Pentagon is the DEA headquarters. And I think it's a little ironic that we had Leicester Dewey growing hemp on this spot, and now they built the main war office for the country on top of it, right across from the DEA's headquarters. So, oh yeah, I'm not doing this very good here. All right, Jamie, you want to? Thanks. All right. So, in any case, if you want to back it up one, Jamie, I want everybody to see this picture of Leicester Dewey. So that's Leicester Dewey at Arlington Farms, and he's got a yardstick up there. It was more than a yardstick, actually. Those plants are about 20 feet tall there. Pretty incredible picture. And so in any case, he also did a lot of other research. If pop to the next one there. These are some of the materials that he produced during his time there. For example, on the one side there is a bulletin on how to use the hemp hurd, which is the woody core of the plant, to make paper. That was done in the early 1900s, and he talked about how you could use a plant to make paper as opposed to having to cut down trees, and the efficiency of that. And so we knew about this, and yet, here we are still cutting down trees to make paper all this time. So anyways, he did a lot of interesting work there. So around the time when Leicester Dewey was in the middle of all his research, and we got to a lot of hype about marijuana began to come up in the press. There was really a Reefer Madness campaign that was launched by the head of a new bureau of government called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a guy named Harry Anslinger, and in coordination with the Hearst newspapers. And William Randolph Hearst owned newspapers all over the country, and had very, very powerful in terms of the reach. And so they were running this, these marijuana is going to be this horrible drug that's wild orgies and parties. You can see all this great hype there. And they had some pretty incredible stories, and it basically whipped the public into a, sort of a frenzy that they were concerned that marijuana was this really bad drug that was going to, that they needed to do something about. So that led to Unslinger's goal of the Marijuana Tax Act. So the first way they figured out how to control or to begin to control marijuana at the federal level was when they passed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. It didn't actually make hemp illegal. It just made it so that you had to pay a tax and you had to get a stamp. You can see down there in the bottom there's a stamp. So now the farmer wants to go ahead and grow hemp, and he's got to get this stamp, he's got to pay a tax, and he's got to get this stamp, and it says producer of marijuana on it. And he's, this is already throwing up barriers to your typical farmer who didn't have to do anything if he wanted to grow corn or wheat or other crops. So in any case, that was the beginning of real problems for hemp and for the hemp industry. At the same time, you had some really important developments with technological developments that were helping to make the processing of hemp more efficient. Some of the traditional methods I showed you earlier, using the more hand methods, they'd come up with new equipment, and in the early 1900s and by the 1930s, they'd had sort of perfected this decorticator, which is a mechanical separation equipment. This is an example of it here. That picture came from this article that was published in 1938 in Popular Mechanics magazine called "The Hemp, the New Billion-Dollar Crop." And they talked about how hemp had 25,000 uses, and really were promoting it as something that would be important. At the same time, this Marijuana Tax Act was having a negative effect on farmers potentially growing it. Then we had World War II kicked in, and the federal government, once the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the fiber supplies from the Philippines were cut off, and the federal government immediately started a campaign to get farmers to grow hemp for the war, because we needed fiber for things like parachute webbing and ropes and whatever. And so they actually had this. There's a video online. If it's only about 7 or 8 minutes long. If you get a chance, go to YouTube and look up Hemp For Victory, and you can see it. It's pretty fascinating because it's the U.S. government propaganda film trying to get farmers to grow hemp, talking about what a great crop it is, how it's been grown for thousands of years and everything. So that process ramped up pretty quickly. They built 13 processing plants, the War Department did. And then by 1943, they had almost 150,000 acres of hemp that was grown across the Midwest, primarily places like Indiana. Kentucky was the primary supplier of seed, and Wisconsin, a number of other states were involved. All right. So after the war, the federal government didn't continue to sort of support hemp anymore. They didn't feel like they needed it anymore. So those plants that had been set up by the government were kind of left to rot. There was still some commercial activity around hemp, but it started to wane. There was competition coming in from synthetic fibers, and there just wasn't support, and there was still this sort of stigma of that you were growing marijuana. And so really the last hemp crops of that area were grown around 1957, from what we know, in Wisconsin and then in Florida. So what's the next thing? How do we get to today? The Marijuana Tax Act ultimately was changed by Congress in 1970 when they decided to ban marijuana along with a bunch of other drugs under the Controlled Substances Act. And Congress initially, without any sort of scientific review or anything, decided to put marijuana into Schedule I, which is the most restrictive category that you can have. It can't be used for medicine. It can't be used for anything. Doctor can't prescribe it. And it made it almost impossible to even do research with it. So you could get a license to grow it, but the DEA would require, 10-foot high barbed wire fencing and alarm systems, and just made it completely unreasonable that anyone would really be able to work with it. There were a couple of people that were crazy enough to try to do that in the meantime. Got a couple good pictures here. Up on the top there is Dr. Dave West. He's an agronomist from Wisconsin, and he actually worked with folks in Hawaii to do a small research project there. They did get approval through the DEA, and they grew I believe it was about a quarter acre. Hawaii was very excited about hemp because they had, the climate there is, you can grow multiple crops a year, and they thought Of course, everything has to be imported onto the island of Hawaii. They don't have much that's actually grown there, so they thought it could be a really useful crop. Unfortunately, the hassles with the project were just too much. Each year you had to apply for a new license, and the DEA would drag its feet. It took many months, and ultimately got frustrated and gave up on the project. There was also another one in California. A gentleman named Chris Boucher with the Hempstead Company got a local USDA research station to agree to allow them to plant a crop, and they imported seeds legally. And but apparently the government of California decided they didn't like the idea. So before the crop was actually harvested, it ended up getting plowed under. So those were the two research projects that I'm aware of. So as we move forward, the hemp industry started in the 90s, but one of the things that was really, became obvious to everybody. I talked about how the goal was to grow hemp. Well, that we needed a political arm in order to be able to try to change the law, because it just wasn't happening. And so members of the Hemp Industries Association started an organization called Vote Hemp. It's a 501c4 nonprofit, primarily focused just on changing the law at state and federal level to let farmers grow hemp commercially. And so there was an important case in 2001. Actually, the DEA has really just been absolutely, has worked in every way they could to try to stop any efforts to allow hemp to be grown. They actually passed, they issued a regulation. So federal agencies are allowed to regulate things under their purview, like in this case, cannabis. And so they issued a regulation. And the definition of marijuana specifically says that the plant is illegal, the cannabis plant is illegal, but then it has these exemptions that allow for the fiber from the stalk, the seed, as long as it's incapable of germination. And that's how people were able to import all these products, because the products were legal, it's just the plant you couldn't grow, or you couldn't have the leaves and flowers. So anyways, the DEA tried to make hemp seeds or anything from the hemp plant that was consumable illegal by saying that if it had any THC on it, that it would be illegal. Well, the hemp industry had started, there had been a handful of companies that had popped up with food products coming out, and these food products had, might have tiny traces. I mean, we're talking about parts per million here, just tiny traces, but still enough that you could potentially measure it on a, in any case, the DEA had issued these rules, and all of a sudden stores were pulling the products off the shelf. Stores like Whole Foods and natural foods co-ops were very concerned that the DEA was going to come in and go after them. And so the hemp industry had to kind of react to that. And so a group of companies, along with the Hemp Industries Association, filed a lawsuit against the DEA, tried to get an injunction against these rules that they had issued, and ultimately get them overturned. And it was a 3-year process, but was successful, did get an injunction, and ultimately got a ruling from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where they basically said that the DEA could not regulate naturally occurring trace amounts of THC on hemp seeds. So that was a victory, and it's helped propel the hemp food side of the industry forward. A couple of other things you guys might be interested. Vote Hemp it's been a frustrating process. Vote Hemp started in 2000, thinking maybe we'd have hemp legal in 5 years or something like that, and it took a lot longer than we thought. So in any case, at some points we got frustrated, and here's a group of some farmers, a farmer from North Dakota, another one from Vermont there, Will Allen and Wayne Hauge, along with some of the Vote Hemp folks at the DEA's headquarters in Arlington, planting hemp seeds out on their front lawn, and they got arrested. And David Bronner's been at the heart of this too. He also came up with an idea that he wanted to have hemp plants in front of the White House, and he wanted to process them into something, into seed oil. And so he had a cage built, and so he could go down there, and he had a big sign for the president. And this is a shot of David, and he was processing hemp plants in front of the White House there. It took him a little while to cut him out of the cage, and it got quite a bit of publicity. Sorry. All right. So finally, we got to the president. Finally, the Congress was considering the 2014 Farm Bill, and there was an open process for amendments, and we were fortunate that Representative Jared Polis from Colorado was ready to do something, and so he introduced an amendment that would allow university research. And that amendment was voted on the House floor. It was the first time in the modern era we've had any kind of a vote on hemp in Congress, and it passed 225 to 200. And it was, it was a big victory. And then ultimately, Senator McConnell, who's from Kentucky, who has kind of come around in a big way on this issue and is a real promoter of hemp and, up on the Hill, actually was able to expand that a bit and allow for departments of agriculture to be involved in the research and pilot programs. So anyways, by 2014, President Obama signed that bill into law. It included this provision, Section 7606 of the Farm Bill, which allowed for research and pilot programs in states that allow it. And you're going to hear probably some more, hopefully from Mike Lewis, maybe a little bit about that, and maybe some of the other speakers as well. Joel, I know that it's allowed the beginning of an industry here, and there's different things happening in different states. Some states have just decided to do research. Some states have just said, hey, you can register and do whatever you want. Some states have like work through the DEA to actually import seeds and are licensing farmers. There's just a lot of different situations, but it has opened the door. Finally, we have American farmers actually growing hemp and universities able to do research. So, it's incredible that it took this long, but we finally got it started, and we're not going to let up now. We just have to push a little bit further here to get full commercial cultivation. So I'll get a little bit more here. I'll try to wrap up pretty soon. So a little background on the Hemp Industries Association. It was founded in 1994 at a meeting in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was organized by a group called Ecolution for Hemp Awareness. And a lot of different companies at the time came together and decided it was good to sort of form a group to advance common interests. And we've had conferences every year since then, a lot of different places around the country, including in Canada, and I'll have pictures of that later. And our first president was a guy named Chris Conrad, who wrote a book. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the Hemp Lifeline to the Future, but it was an early book about hemp and all the things you could do with it. Here's a picture of a group of HIA, the members attending a conference in Canada. I think it was our first conference where we actually went to a hemp field, because the first 4 or 5 years we did it all on US soil. And some other shots from a couple of other conferences. So it's been a good camaraderie. And I just wanted to show a few of the people that, there's so many people that have worked on hemp over the years, and there's no way I could display everybody, but I thought I'd just give you, guys a little taste of some of the people here that were important early on. I want to specifically mention Alex Whiteplume. If I had a pointer, I'd show you there, but he's the fellow in the reddish shirt there with sitting on the stairs next to some plants. He's a Native American from the Lakota tribe in South Dakota. And Alex grew hemp several years on his property in South Dakota. And unfortunately, the DEA, you'd think that these guys have more important things to do than chase after somebody who's just growing hemp, but they actually came in and cut down his crop. And then when he grew it again, the next year they actually filed they went to court to get an injunction against him so he couldn't grow hemp. And I think it's pretty outrageous. And the DEA is still doing this kind of stuff. But just this past year, the Menominee tribe, and these are sovereign nations on their own land, and they had a law that allowed it under tribal law. The Menominee planted hemp last year, and once again the DEA came in and they cut down the entire crop. Just a ridiculous, abuse of their sovereignty. So. We've been trying to do what we can to help both groups. There's court cases going on both situations, trying to get that resolved. But anyway, some other interesting people. There's Jack Herr up on the top right. There's Jack Herr and Chris Conrad. Jack's the author of the book, and then Chris was the HIA's first president, the other author. Andy Graves is next to them. He's a farmer in Kentucky. He was working on this early. A bunch of other interesting people from the hemp movement. And then. Let's talk about some of the people that are doing it today. That's the most exciting thing to me, is that we've got people like Mike Lewis and Joel Bedard and Jamie, working on the ground, making hemp happen right now here in the United States. Changing laws and planting hemp and moving this industry forward. And it's been such a long time. Just the folks in this picture, there's a Dave Williams at the University of Kentucky with the Senator McConnell. We got Katie Moyer, who's a Kentucky farmer. We've got Ryan Laughlin from Colorado. these are just a sampling of a few of the people, but there's a lot of good people out there that are really actually making like the really important history right now, and so I really want to pay tribute to them. As I mentioned, after that Farm Bill passed, we had a handful of crops in the ground the first year in 2014. Mike was one of the first to plant. Mike planted in 2014 in Kentucky. And then we had more crops in 2015. When that Farm Bill was actually signed into law, there were only 10 states that allowed for hemp. We now have 27 that have laws, although they don't all have programs yet. And then my final slide, just wanted to mention that there's several bills in Congress pending that are going to move things to where we want them to be, which is to allow full commercial hemp farming under state law. And that's Senate Bill 134 and House Bill HR 525. And if you guys go to votehemp.com/takeaction, you can write a letter to your senators and congressmen and tell them, that you'd like to see these bills. Ask them to co-sponsor it. Tell them that we need to see these bills passed so that we can change this law and get back to where we were on hemp farming. So thank you very much.